I've been working now on designing environmental campaigns, both on forest conservation and climate change for 30 years. And I don't think there's a more important conversation right now than how do we communicate the climate emergency, not just to inform and to educate, but to motivate people to engage in this issue at this critical moment in history. I thought I would start by reflecting a little bit on where people are, what they know, and why I've decided to focus, along with thousands of people around the world, my efforts specifically on fossil fuels and the fossil fuel treaty. Bear with me for one moment while I just share my screen. I should have also mentioned that I am speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Squamish First Nations, where I'm honored to be able to live and work here in Vancouver, Canada. So I think that should have worked.
Yes, it did.
I'm just gonna, good. A thumbs up, you're just seeing one slide, the front slide. The other day I did a presentation where everyone was seeing my notes. It was horrifying. No one told me till afterwards. First of all, we know that around the world there is a growing concern about climate change, and largely tied to the dramatic increase that we have all seen and experienced, many more than others, in their daily lives because of extreme weather events. Yet what we also know from the polling is that there's a very low literacy about the causes of climate change and the solutions. So this growing awareness is important, but what do people support that we do about climate change, and are they engaging? In my mind, those are the two critical questions to creating the political space to act quick enough to save lives and make the U-turn that we need to make in our economies, in our daily lives, in our policies and laws in order to address the climate emergency. So let's take a look specifically at Brazil. We know that a large majority of Brazilians think climate change is happening, that it's a serious threat, and even support climate action. When you add the number of people who are alarmed to the number of people who are concerned, then you're looking at 79% in Brazil think climate change is happening and think it's important. What's very interesting, though, is that the majority of people are split about whether or not to phase out fossil fuels. So this is a critical point in our discussion about the climate emergency, because while climate policy and climate solutions are complicated, what's not complicated is that 86% of the emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere today come from three products: oil, gas, and coal. And the fossil fuel industry has been successful in making those products, even the language of fossil fuels, even reference to oil, gas, and coal when you talk about climate change, invisible. Let's take, for example, the Paris Agreement, the world's agreement on how to address climate change. I'll never forget the day when I searched the Paris Agreement for the words fossil fuels. They weren't there. Then for the words oil, gas, and coal. They don't exist in the world's climate agreement. Again, the fossil fuel industry has been successful in making itself invisible. And that's, I think, a critical point for climate communications. I believe our job as climate communicators is to make that visible, to focus on the critical issue of creating plans to responsibly and equitably wind down fossil fuel production and emissions in line with the science in order to address growing climate change. So one of the big problem is when faced with the major threat of climate change and even concerns that they already have, what we're seeing is that we don't have the political will, in part because a kind of fatalism sets in. We still use fossil fuels every day, and we are hardwired to feel guilty for that use. Why are we hardwired to feel guilty for that use? Because the fossil fuel industry has focused attention on our personal carbon footprint as the answer to driving solutions to climate change. So it's easier for people to check out of the conversation, to turn away when they're faced with something that is, in the literature, it's called a cognitive dissonance. We know that climate change is happening. When you start connecting the fact that it's happening to fossil fuels, then there's just a disconnect with our daily lives. And it seems too big to actually engage in. People are uncomfortable. So in some ways, the public is I don't know if this translates. In English, we would say between a rock and a hard place on fossil fuels. We don't want oil, gas, or coal, or the pollution and risks that are pervasive in our lives as a result of it. You know, one thing that's very useful for the conversation on fossil fuels today is not just to focus on climate change as the reason we need to phase out fossil fuels, because climate change is invisible. It's, unless you're faced with the extreme weather, it's hard to visualize that pollution. Carbon is often invisible, but the health impacts of climate change are very real. The newest studies are showing that 1 in 5 deaths globally, 8 to 9 million people a year, are dying just from the air pollution of fossil fuels, let alone the disasters, the spills, the explosions, and then also climate change and extreme weather. So leaning into the health impacts of fossil fuels in the last couple of years, I've found a lot more traction with the public because they can see it. We also see in the climate campaigns around the world that leaning into specific pieces of fossil fuel infrastructure, pipelines, coal plants, new LNG terminals, this makes the issues more tangible to people than this target by this date. It's complicated, but the fossil fuel projects can make it more tangible and find a hook for us to discuss what needs to happen. So it's challenging for people to see the world beyond where they're currently living. Many of us still in fossil fuel cars, fossil fuel heating. And again, this is in part because this is the conversation the industry has wanted. The industry has associated themselves with being a big part of the solution, innovatives for the future. Yet their net zero pledges, every single oil company and its net zero pledges, within those net zero commitments, they currently plan to increase production of fossil fuels with new projects and new fields. One thing we have to remember as we communicate this challenge, it's not a transition if we're continuing to grow the problem. And the science clearly shows us that no new fossil fuel projects fit or align with our Paris Agreement, with our Paris goals, with keeping the world well below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We already have enough fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal in production or under construction on the planet that if we burned them all, that would take us past 2 degrees. So we are currently spending the majority of the world's financial and political and intellectual capital to dig up stuff that we know we can't burn, or it will burn us. And the simplicity of recognizing that, of really focusing on how the transition and climate responsibility focuses on expanding the problem, that makes sense to people. And the polling we've done at the Fossil Fuel Treaty in now 6 different markets around the world is showing that consistently that makes sense to people. When you ask them if they support this target by this date or this policy, they're confused. When you talk generally about acting on the climate emergency, they feel guilty. When you specifically show where the majority of pollution is coming from, And that it's not about one project being bad or one country needing to act, but we need to stop expansion all over the globe and wind it down. That makes more sense to people, and they start to engage. But they start to engage if they feel like they can support a solution which is commensurate with the scale of the problem. So for too long, we've heard climate emergency, the world is on fire, put on a sweater, ride to work and save up for that electric car. And it makes people feel so guilty, and those solutions are so small, they don't know how to engage. At this point, I think it's worthwhile mentioning that the concept of the personal carbon footprint that focused the world on lifestyle and personal change instead of system change and the laws that we need to address climate change, well, that came from the oil companies. And in fact, it was BP starting 20 years ago that started to really put advertising dollars around this concept of the carbon footprint, because they didn't want people to organize against fossil fuels as a whole. They wanted you to feel guilty and then disassociate yourself from the larger challenge that we have. So what do we do now? It's time to change the narrative. We need to communicate to motivate and not just to educate. It's for all of these reasons that myself and a growing network of civil society, government, Indigenous, youth, former diplomats, politicians, now over 260 elected officials from 60 countries around the world are supporting new international cooperation to stop the expansion of fossil fuels under a fossil fuel treaty. A major goal of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative is to change the narrative, to shift the conversation about fossil fuels. We have all grown up with the social norm that increasing production of oil, gas, and coal means prosperity. We need to flip that social norm to recognize that today fossil fuels are weapons of mass destruction. They are a greater threat to global security and global and to economic security, to lives and livelihood, than almost any other thing on earth. And the good news is we have the solutions, we have the alternatives at hand. So placing oil, gas, and coal squarely to blame for the climate emergency and its expansion puts this as the greatest threat to humanity, but not leaving people in a state of fatalism by bringing to the need for and viability of a fair and fast transition to clean energy and other low carbon solutions, helping people feel a part of something bigger, something that is greater than the sum of our parts. So momentum on the fossil fuel treaty is growing because the solution is big, it's bold, but we need new international cooperation to stop the expansion of fossil fuels. Because for decades, we've been negotiating emissions, and we now have the Paris Agreement, and many countries around the world are successfully or working to reduce emissions. But behind our backs, the fossil fuel industry has been growing production. We are currently on track to produce 110% more fossil fuels than the world can ever burn. Let me say that again. We're currently on track to produce 110% more fossil fuels than we can ever use. So the good news is momentum has been incredible. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is less than 2 years old. In 2 years, over 1,000, this actual slide needs to be updated from the last 2 weeks, 1,500 civil society organizations have already joined and endorsed the Fossil Fuel Treaty and are starting to plan fossil fuel treaty campaigns around the world. Almost 3,000 scientists and academics, 270 elected parliamentarians, 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, and now 53 cities and states, subnationals, have passed motions in councils to endorse the fossil fuel treaty. Part of what we've been trying to do with this initiative is highlight the fact that if we are going to stop expansion, and manage a global wind down of fossil fuel production and emissions, the wealthy countries must act first. A lot of people don't realize that the majority of expansion of oil and gas planned in the next 5 years is planned in the wealthy countries. In fact, the far majority is planned in the United States. So this is not an issue of taking away economic opportunities from the global south. In fact, the majority of expansion is in these 5 wealthy countries. And that's why at COP26, we released this report on the fossil fuel 5 that you can get on our website. So we need to recognize that we need international cooperation, because there are many countries in the world, Brazil included, especially countries like Ecuador in Latin America, drilling for new oil in the heart of the Amazon just to feed their debt. So those countries will need new agreements, new support and coordination to not expand fossil fuel production at this critical moment in history. So we're finding in our message testing now in 6 countries, the US, Canada, Kenya, India, Philippines, and Brazil, that the concept of the fossil fuel treaty works as a frame. Why? Because people know we need to move away from fossil fuels, but don't know how to make it happen. The fossil fuel treaty sounds like something that is big enough, that is commensurate with the scale of the problem. We find that people, it's hard to believe any countries will act alone. So the treaty addresses this competitiveness issue that all treaties have. The 110% more fossil fuels being planned works as a motivator. That figure sticks when we poll it. It's not a small, manageable amount. It's a crisis, and we need to act together to stop it. And shining a light on a number of actors, such as we did in the fossil fuel 5 versus big oil, makes the issue something that can be tackled and focuses responsibility back where it should be, on our governments to ensure the public good at this critical moment. So the fossil fuel treaty is now being used as a frame by groups around the world, youth groups in many countries, grassroots activists all over the world. This was a moment for me just a couple of weeks ago at Stockholm Plus 50 when I went to a big protest in Sweden and saw a fossil fuel treaty banner hanging proudly, not by any of our staff, by some organization that is now campaigning on the fossil fuel treaty. It's now being used by groups around the world. And this year, faith leaders from around the world are picking up the call for the fossil fuel treaty and starting a whole new faith initiative. Sometimes there's skepticism about the treaty being too bold, about it being not viable because it's so new. It took us so many years to negotiate the Paris Agreement. I offer that at this moment in history, we need big, bold new ideas, because what we've been doing so far has not been working. We need to motivate people around the world to be a part of something that is simple, that they can call on their governments to do, that gets at the scale of the problem. Nelson Mandela once said, "It always feels impossible until it's done." And I hold on to that every day when I'm working for the new fossil fuel treaty, less than 2 years old. And already there are groups around the world who are calling on their governments for a fossil fuel treaty. Already we can feel the strength of this new public campaign and network. So I offer this as one example. But in terms of the communications work that we're doing here today, I encourage you to put the focus back where it needs to be on fossil fuels, to make this fight for a livable climate tangible, to put the onus where it needs to be on stopping pollution, and to try to find a way to encourage the public to engage in these issues at this critical moment in history. Thank you.